In the Shimane province of Japan, there is a smelter that is lit for only one night each year, where steel is made in the same way it was 1,300 years ago. And what is left to show for all that hard work is a 100 kilogram block of steel, iron, and slag. Only around a third of this block is high enough quality to be used in sword making.
A block, a lump of steel, iron, and slag. Notice iron. The reason why it's iron is that it's a very imperfect method of steel smelting, okay? There is a whole heap of iron ore that didn't even get diffused with carbon. It's interesting, the Tatara method, in the sense that it's a really big bloomery furnace, because this, in a bloomery furnace that's smaller, your result is called a bloom, and it gets mashed together, and then folding is necessary, which kind of homogenizes it can homogenize the different grades of steel, because it always results in different grades of steel. It didn't liquefy, and then it can also push out a lot of non-metallic inclusions. By making a much bigger one, instead of just mashing it all together and then homogenizing it, they're able to pick out clumps of higher carbon steel versus the lower carbon steel. And that's set aside, and that is the tamahagane. This whole thing is not tamahagane, okay? A lot of it is just going to be iron, mild steel, mild carbon steel, so low carbon steel, medium carbon steel, and then you have the high carbon steel, and then you also have some like really high carbon steel, pig iron and things, which is actually the tamahagane, by the way, the really high carbon stuff. And in its state as is, the carbon is too high to make a good functional blade. The folding process actually decarburizes a bit to make it fall in the more functional range of high carbon steel, but left by itself, it's not the best. But it is also the direct point of irrefutable proof that this is a very imperfect way of steel smelting. Doesn't even liquefy at all. It all is this kind of mess with different grades of steel all over the place. And by the way, right, I've mentioned multiple cultures did this. This was a very common way of steel smelting in medieval Europe for a good while, all right? And it has all the imperfections there. And if anyone from medieval Europe or the Middle East or Asia or India, anywhere, right, was trying to inflate its brilliance in the quality of steel it was making, I would correct that just as much. But it seems like the Tatara and this method of making, steel just gets inflated way beyond the realms of what its real actual quality is. And that's why it always seems like I'm bashing the katana or the traditional way katana is made. No, it's because of the misinformation. In terms of being able to make steel that can, through processes, result in really good quality swords or tools or whatever, it's a very useful way of producing steel. Nothing against that. People have used it all across the world, all right? I'm not dunking on it in that sense. I'm pushing it back against its inflated status of being something particularly special when it's not.
The steel is sorted by quality and carbon content, which is also done by eye.
Most of that steel, right, is just going to be used to make tools, and whatever else they need to make out of steel. And the high carbon stuff, of course, because there's less of it, they're reserving that for not only the katana, right, but the edge of the katana, okay? The core, and even sometimes the sides of a katana is made out of the medium carbon and even low carbon stuff. And because most of it's low carbon, well, they use low carbon, sometimes just near iron as the core of the katana, which isn't necessarily a good thing. People usually latch onto that as some ingenious method to make a superior sword. No, not necessarily. No, it doesn't result. Like, if you could have a core out of a better quality steel, because you can have steel, right, that cool it differently. You can have differential hardening and everything that can still be a bit softer, but not as bad as iron, right? One of the reasons why they use such low quality steel, low carbon steel, is the core and stuff. More likely was because that's all they had. They had so little high carbon steel that they only had enough to make it on the edge, all right? You will get the result of a much higher quality sword by making the whole thing high carbon, all right, and then tempering it into a spring and make it a spring steel katana. That is just a superior, stronger, more durable sword. Why didn't they do that? one of the more likely reasons is they didn't have enough of it, enough of the high carbon, because only so little of that bloom that comes out of the Tatara was actually high carbon. So if they want to make the highest amount of swords, which all have really high carbon edges, well, they are kind of minimalizing the amount needed of that high carbon steel for the most amount of swords possible, and then just using the rest of the crap to make up the rest. It's not because it results in a higher quality sword. It's more about utilizing the resources that you get out of this imperfect way of making steel and the limited amount of steel that they have to begin with, right? In the most efficient, optimal way possible in the sense of making the most amount of good quality swords. And so economically, there's some real this is a very smart way of utilizing a very limited resource to produce the highest amounts of high carbon edged blades possible, okay? But it's not because it makes a better sword. So there are things to be praised about the ingenious nature, the clever nature of doing this, but it's not because it was superior for the actual function and utility and durability of the sword itself.
They use steel with different carbon contents for different parts of the blade. The edge is always high carbon steel to make it hard and rigid so it can maintain a sharp edge for a long time, but the spine is usually made of lower carbon steel, which allows the sword to flex without breaking.
Allows the sword to flex without breaking. That's a very charitable way of saying that it means the sword will stay bent when it bends, because it's a low carbon steel, especially even if you quench it right and try and temper it, it's not going to adopt martensite that is then tempered to have, a spring quality. And the notion that having the softer core results in a superior sword is false. Okay, it's mainly due to limited resources of the higher carbon steel. And look, there is one possible benefit out of it, okay? Because they do make the edge harder, okay, in terms of the carbon content and the quenching rate, and it gets tempered to a lesser extent to release some of that tension in the martensite structure, that the edge can be a bit more brittle. And if you had an entire sword, to that level of hardness through hardened, very high chance of it just snapping in two. And so the way that you can prevent it from snapping in two by having a much higher, harder, but also fragile edge is having that soft core. And then what Derek says is accurate, that as a result, it won't snap in two when it bends. He says flexes, but it's not going to flex back. It'll stay bent. And the utility of having a really hard edge like this is a bit of give and take. It's not universally better, okay? We've tested super hard edges against hard things, right? And the result was the super hard edges were brittle. Yeah, that's the result. When it comes up to something too hard, big chips in the blade. Having a blade that instead of chipping gets just a bit of an indent or a small little crack, kind of like the damage that you see on this sword here, if you see that damage, that is vastly more preferable than a big chip. And so it holds its edge really long. It's still considered a high carbon hard edge, just not as high as certain traditional katanas. And as a result, it's more durable and less brittle. And that is preferable. That type of damage on a sword is repairable. Having a big chunk chip out off your blade edge is basically a ruined sword. And it is also a crucial weak point for the rest of the sword to break through as well. But it does mean it'll hold its edge longer, okay, in terms of just general bluntness, and it varies because there are different materials in which it will perform well against. And so soft to medium materials, it does really well with. So that actually includes bone, but also wood. We have found really hard edges keep their edge retention pretty darn good against wood and stuff like that. And so for general kind of hardness of materials, a really hard edge like the Katana has significant results and benefits, but then there's the brittleness part. And usually the just a lower bit of hardness, and it's not by much, is still very hard, retains its edge very long, and is more durable, is a much preferable sword construction, honestly. And this idea that it was always a soft core was because it produced a superior sword is false. It's actually more of an economic benefit, still very smart, because it means they can make more swords out of the limited high carbon steel they have than not. Thanks for visiting the Shadlands, the place to find quick and easy to watch sword related content. This video was a supercut or clip from a larger Shadiversity video. If you'd like to see the full length video, please click on the provided links, and I hope to see you in the future.